December 18, 1944. A frozen foxhole in Belgium. One American corporal. One captured German radio. And exactly 4 hours to save 300 sleeping soldiers from being crushed by 40 Panzer tanks. The odds were impossible. The plan was forbidden. And the punishment for failure was death by court-martial. But Eddie Voss wasn't thinking about regulations that night. He was thinking about the German commander whose voice he'd memorized for 72 hours straight. A man he'd never met. A man he was about to impersonate. A man he was about to send to his death. This is the story of how a telephone company troubleshooter from Milwaukee became the most dangerous voice on the Western Front. How breaking every single rule in the military handbook saved an entire battalion, and why the United States Army tried to bury what happened next. Before this night was over, Eddie Voss would speak perfect German into enemy frequencies, redirect an armored column into American minefields, and change the course of the Battle of the Bulge forever. But first, he had to become someone else entirely. The winter of 1944 was supposed to be the beginning of the end. Allied forces had liberated Paris in August. They'd pushed the Germans back across France. Military planners in Washington were already discussing occupation zones for a defeated Reich. The war in Europe, everyone agreed, would be over by Christmas. Then Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine. On December 16, 1944, over 400,000 German troops smashed through the thinly defended Ardennes forest. American lines didn't just break, they shattered. Entire divisions were encircled within hours. Communication networks collapsed. Supply lines were cut. In the chaos that followed, thousands of American soldiers found themselves isolated, surrounded, and utterly alone in the frozen Belgian wilderness. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and it was a disaster of unprecedented scale. In the first 3 days alone, American forces suffered over 19,000 casualties. Units that had been resting behind what everyone assumed were safe lines suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against panzer divisions that appeared from nowhere. The problem wasn't just German strength. It was American blindness. Intelligence had failed catastrophically. Commanders had no idea where German units were moving. Radio communications were jammed, intercepted, or simply non-functional in the brutal winter conditions. Men were dying because information wasn't flowing. Orders weren't reaching the front. Warnings weren't being heard. Near the town of Bastogne, the situation was particularly desperate. American forces were encircled. Supply drops were being shot out of the sky. And German armored columns were probing for weaknesses, looking for the soft underbelly that would allow them to split the Allied forces in two. Every night, German commanders coordinated their movements over radio frequencies that American intelligence was supposed to be monitoring. But the system was overwhelmed. Too many frequencies. Too few trained translators. Too much chaos. Critical intelligence was being missed. German units were moving undetected. And American soldiers were dying in ambushes that could have been prevented if only someone had been listening. But someone was listening. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. Eddie Voss had never planned to be a hero. Born in 1923 to German immigrants in Milwaukee, he'd grown up speaking 2 languages and belonging to neither world completely. His parents had fled Europe before the Nazi rise to power, but that didn't matter much after Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, speaking German at home became dangerous. Neighbors who'd been friendly for years started looking at the Voss family differently. Eddie learned to keep his grandmother's language hidden, a secret skill that would one day save hundreds of lives. Before the war, Eddie worked for the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company as a troubleshooter. His job was simple, but required a particular kind of genius. When electrical systems failed, Eddie listened. Not to what people said was wrong, but to the equipment itself. Transformers had rhythms. Circuit breakers had personalities. He could hear problems in the hum of machinery before they became catastrophic. This ability to find patterns in noise to extract meaning from chaos would become the most valuable skill on the Western Front. The Army tested Eddie's German during basic training in 1943. They marked him fluent and should have assigned him to signals intelligence in London, translating intercepts at a comfortable desk far from danger. Instead, some bureaucratic error landed him with the 101st Airborne as a field radio operator. He fixed equipment. He relayed coordinates. He spent most of his time cold, wet, and bored, until the Bulge changed everything. When the German offensive shattered American lines, Eddie found himself in a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne with a functioning radio, a pair of high-quality headphones scavenged from a destroyed German half-track, and nothing but time. So he started doing what he'd always done. He started listening. At first, it was just curiosity. He'd spin the dial through the spectrum, picking up fragments of German chatter, tank crews reporting positions, infantry calling for ammunition, artillery observers adjusting fire. Nothing he could act on. Just voices in the dark. But Eddie's troubleshooter brain couldn't stop analyzing. Within 72 hours, he could recognize individual German operators by voice alone. He knew which Panzer battalion was operating northeast of Bastogne. He knew their fuel situation was critical, and he knew their commander was cautious, methodical, and terrified of mines. That commander's call sign was Iron Fist 4. But Eddie had started thinking of him as Klaus. The idea came to Eddie on the fourth night, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, terrible realization. He'd been listening to Klaus receive orders for 3 days. He knew exactly how German command structured their transmissions, the call signs, the format, the specific phrases that preceded every coordinate. He knew that Klaus always paused before acknowledging orders he disagreed with. He knew that Klaus questioned unfamiliar voices, but trusted the familiar pattern of commands he'd heard 1,000 times before. And Eddie knew something else. Something that made his blood run cold. The Germans had stopped authenticating transmissions with proper code sequences. There wasn't time anymore. Instead, they relied on recognition, on knowing their officers' voices, on the familiar cadence of orders delivered in the same format they'd heard throughout the war. It was faster, it was practical, and it was a catastrophic vulnerability if someone like Eddie happened to be listening. The plan formed in Eddie's mind like ice crystallizing on a window. What if he could transmit orders that sounded exactly like the ones Klaus expected? What if the call sign was right, the format correct, the accent perfect? What if the orders themselves were tactically reasonable, just subtly redirected? Klaus wouldn't question familiar patterns delivered in familiar ways. He'd simply obey. The implications were staggering. Eddie could redirect German armored columns. He could send them away from American positions. He could send them into minefields, into ambushes, into certain death, all with nothing but his voice and a captured radio. But there was a problem. Actually, there were many problems. Broadcasting on enemy frequencies without authorization was a court-martial offense. Impersonating enemy command was technically a war crime under certain interpretations. If the Germans detected the deception and triangulated his position, they'd rain artillery on his foxhole until nothing remained but a smoking crater. And even if everything went perfectly, Eddie would be sending men to their deaths. Real men. Men with families. Men who were just following orders. Men like Klaus who sounded tired and wanted to go home, but would do his duty anyway. The moral weight was crushing. But that night, Eddie intercepted something that made the decision for him. Klaus was receiving new orders. His Panzer column was being redirected toward a fuel depot 2 miles west. A fuel depot currently surrounded by 300 American infantry who had no idea they were about to be crushed by 40 tanks. Eddie had maybe 4 hours to act. He tried the proper channels first. Eddie reached for his transmitter to call headquarters with his warning. But proper channels took time. Verification. Approval chains. By the time his warning crawled up to someone who could act on it, German tanks would already be grinding through American foxholes. So Eddie made a decision that would change everything. He reached for the captured German radio and began adjusting frequencies. At 216 hours on December 19th, Eddie keyed the transmitter. His voice cut through the static with the precision of a blade. He'd pitched it slightly deeper than his natural register, adding the gravelly authority of a Prussian officer who'd spent 20 years commanding tanks. Iron Fist 4. This is Tank Group Command. New orders. Silence. 5 seconds of nothing but atmospheric hiss. Then Klaus's voice came through the smoker's rasp Eddie had memorized. Tank Group Command. This is Iron Fist 4. Ready to receive. Eddie forced himself to pause. Real commanders didn't rush. They spoke with the certainty of men whose words would be obeyed without question. Iron Fist 4. Your current attack route is being changed. Aerial reconnaissance has identified minefields along your original route. Eddie held his breath. Minefields. The word that made Klaus hesitate every single time. The trauma of watching crews incinerated by buried explosives. The pause lasted 7 seconds. Eddie counted every one. New route confirmed, Klaus finally responded. Coordinates, please. Eddie rattled off a series of grid references, each one carefully chosen, each one leading Klaus's column exactly where it needed to go. Not toward the fuel depot, not toward 300 sleeping Americans. Toward ground that both sides knew was lethal. Coordinates confirmed. Iron Fist 4 will execute. Will. Estimated arrival, 0530. Eddie released the transmit button. His hands were shaking. He'd just sentenced men to death. But 2 miles west, 300 American soldiers would wake up alive. At 0532 hours, the first explosion tore through the frozen Belgian countryside. Then the second. Then the third. By the time the cascading detonation stopped, 12 German Panzer tanks had been destroyed. Klaus died instantly when his command tank triggered a mine. He never knew he'd been deceived. Never knew the orders came from an American foxhole instead of German high command. 23 other German tank crew members died in the first 30 seconds. The entire Iron Fist battalion was effectively destroyed. Not by superior tactics or overwhelming firepower, but by a voice that convinced them safety lay in the one direction that guaranteed their annihilation. 2 miles west, 300 American soldiers woke to distant explosions, grabbed weapons, and prepared for an assault that never came. They would never know Eddie's name. There would be no medals, no parades. Captain Morrison appeared at Eddie's foxhole 3 hours later. He didn't come with MPs. He came alone. Those notes you kept, he said quietly, that intelligence saved lives. A lot of lives. He paused. I'm writing a report stating the German column was deceived by Allied psychological operations. I'm recommending you for commendation, and I'm transferring you to Luxembourg immediately. I never want to see you near enemy radio equipment again. Eddie nodded. He understood. What he'd done was forbidden. What he'd done was necessary. And what he'd done would never appear in any official history. But this was only the beginning. Because somewhere in German high command intelligence officers were asking uncomfortable questions. How had Iron Fist 4 received orders that didn't come from any authorized source? How had an entire Panzer battalion driven into minefields believing they were flanking an ambush? And most disturbing of all, was there an American somewhere who could speak perfect German, who understood Wehrmacht radio protocols, who could impersonate their officers so perfectly that even experienced commanders couldn't tell the difference? The answer to that question would lead to one of the most classified operations of World War II. An operation that would expand Eddie's single act of desperate heroism into something far larger. Something that would save not hundreds of lives, but thousands. Something that the military would keep secret for decades. In Part 2, we'll discover what happened when German intelligence realized they had a ghost in their radio networks. How the army transformed Eddie's forbidden technique into an official weapon of war, and why the greatest radio deception operation of World War II was almost destroyed by the very bureaucracy it was designed to protect. The voice in the static was just getting started. In Part 1, we witnessed the impossible. A telephone company troubleshooter from Milwaukee named Eddie Voss broke every rule in the military handbook. He intercepted German radio transmissions without authorization. He memorized an enemy commander's voice for 72 hours. And on one frozen December night, he spoke perfect German into a captured radio, redirecting 40 Panzer tanks into American minefields. 300 American soldiers woke up alive. An entire German battalion was annihilated. And Eddie Voss was transferred to Luxembourg before anyone could ask uncomfortable questions. But the story didn't end there. Because somewhere in German intelligence headquarters, radio specialists were analyzing transmission logs. They'd found something that didn't make sense. Orders that came from nowhere. A voice that matched no authorized officer. A ghost in their frequencies that had sent Iron Fist 4 to its death. Within 72 hours, every German commander on the Western Front would receive the same chilling warning. Trust nothing you hear. Verify everything. The Americans have learned to speak our language, and this is where everything got worse. The official report landed on Colonel Harrison Blake's desk on December 23, 1944. Blake commanded the Signal Intelligence Section for the European Theater, a man who'd spent 30 years building protocols, procedures, and chains of command designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos Eddie Voss had created. He read the report 3 times. Then he summoned Eddie to his office in Luxembourg. Eddie had never seen a colonel turn that particular shade of purple before. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Blake's voice was controlled, but barely. The kind of control that came before court-martial proceedings. Eddie stood at attention, eyes forward. "I saved 300 lives, sir. You compromised an entire intelligence operation." Blake slammed the report on his desk. "We've spent 2 years building networks of German speakers for authorized psychological operations. 2 years of careful planning. And you, a corporal with no clearance, no authorization, no training in psychological warfare, you decided to broadcast on enemy frequencies because you had a feeling." "It wasn't a feeling, sir. I had 4 days of intelligence. I knew their commander. I knew their protocols. I knew exactly how to—" "You knew nothing." Blake cut him off. "You got lucky. And your luck has now made every German commander on the Western Front suspicious of their own radio networks. Do you understand what that means?" Eddie said nothing. "It means our actual psychological operations are now compromised. Every deception we've planned, every false order we intended to broadcast, they're all worthless now because the Germans know someone is listening. Because of you." The accusation hung in the air like artillery smoke. Eddie understood the logic. He'd acted alone without coordination, and in doing so, he'd potentially burned an intelligence capability that took years to develop. But he also understood something Blake didn't. "Sir, with respect, if your psychological operations were effective, why were 300 men about to die in an undefended position?" Blake's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern. It is, if I'm the only one who noticed the threat, sir." Eddie's voice was steady. "I monitored those frequencies for 4 days. I heard German units coordinating. I heard supply problems, fuel shortages, command disputes. Intelligence that wasn't reaching anyone who could use it. Because you weren't authorized to. Because your authorized channels are too slow." Blake stood up slowly. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Corporal Voss, you are 1 signature away from a court-martial, impersonating enemy officers, unauthorized broadcasts, theft of classified equipment. I could have you shot." "Yes, sir. But first you should know that German intelligence has already identified the deception. They're calling it a ghost transmission. And they're terrified." For the first time, Blake paused. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm still listening, sir." Eddie met the colonel's eyes. "I know which frequencies they're using to discuss it. I know they've issued warnings to every Panzer commander. And I know they have no idea how we did it or whether we can do it again." The colonel stared at Eddie for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone. "Get me General Bradley's intelligence chief. Tell him we have a situation that requires immediate attention." But before Blake could complete the call, the door opened. A major stepped in, a man Eddie had never seen before. His uniform bore the insignia of the Office of Strategic Services. "Colonel Blake," the major said quietly, I'm afraid General Donovan has already heard about Corporal Voss. He'd like a word. Major William Sterling had been running OSS psychological operations in Europe for 18 months. He'd coordinated with British intelligence-designed deception campaigns and spent more time than he cared to admit trying to convince traditional military officers that warfare wasn't just about bullets and bombs. When he heard about Eddie Voss, he'd driven through the night from Paris. "This is remarkable," Sterling said, flipping through Eddie's notebook of German radio observations. Voice recognition patterns, transmission schedules, emotional analysis of individual operators. Sterling looked up at Eddie. "You developed this methodology yourself, I just listened, sir." Eddie shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Colonel Blake stood in the corner, arms crossed, radiating disapproval. "Patterns emerge if you pay attention long enough." Sterling nodded slowly. "The Germans have spent this entire war assuming their communications are secure. They encrypt important messages, certainly, but routine tactical traffic. They rely on the assumption that even if we intercept it, we can't respond convincingly. They trust their own voices. And you exploited that trust." "Yes, sir." Sterling closed the notebook. "Colonel Blake believes you've compromised our existing psychological operations. He's not entirely wrong. The Germans are now suspicious of unauthorized transmissions. But he's missing the larger picture." Blake stepped forward. "Major, with respect, this corporal acted without any colonel." Sterling interrupted. "Corporal Voss accomplished in one night what your authorized operations haven't achieved in 6 months. He redirected an enemy armored column using nothing but his voice. He destroyed more German tanks than most artillery batteries, and he did it with a methodology that's entirely new." There was silence. Sterling continued. "The Germans aren't just suspicious now. They're paranoid. They're second-guessing every order. They're requesting verification for routine commands." He smiled slightly. "That paranoia is worth more than the operations we've lost. It creates chaos. It slows their response times. It makes them vulnerable to exactly the kind of deception we should be deploying." Blake's expression didn't change. "And what do you propose, Major?" "I propose we test this methodology properly." Sterling turned to Eddie. "Corporal Voss, how would you like to teach the United States Army how to become German?" The test was scheduled for January 3, 1945. General Bradley's intelligence staff had given Sterling exactly one opportunity to prove the concept worked. If Eddie's voice deception methodology failed, the entire program would be terminated. Eddie would face court-martial, and psychological warfare would remain in the hands of men who'd been failing at it for 2 years. The location was a captured German communications facility near Malmedy. American forces had taken it intact, including working radio equipment and enough documentation to understand German tactical frequencies in the sector. Eddie had 9 days to train a team of 6 German speakers in his methodology. 9 days to teach them everything he'd learned in 4 days of desperate listening. The students were a mixed group. 2 were children of German immigrants like Eddie. 1 was a Jewish refugee who'd escaped Berlin in 1938. 3 were OSS operatives who'd learned German in classrooms and could speak it perfectly but had never heard it used in combat. Eddie started with the basics. "Forget what you learned in school," he paced in front of them, speaking German with a Milwaukee accent. "Grammar doesn't matter. Vocabulary doesn't matter. What matters is rhythm, pattern. The specific way a tired panzer commander sounds at 3 a.m. when he's been fighting for 6 weeks straight." He played recordings captured from German transmissions. Listen to how he says "acknowledged." Hear that downward inflection. That's a man who disagrees but won't argue. If you give him orders he doesn't like, you need to sound like someone he won't question. Not aggressive, certain. Like you've never been wrong in your life. The training was brutal. Eddie made them practice for hours, repeating phrases until they sounded less like American students and more like exhausted German officers. He made them study individual enemy operators, learning their verbal tics, their patterns, their fears. Most importantly, Eddie taught them the psychology. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything equally. He drew diagrams on a chalkboard. They're suspicious of anomalies. Things that don't fit the pattern. If you match the pattern perfectly, suspicion never triggers. By the 8th day, Eddie's team could conduct simulated German radio conversations that fooled native speakers. But simulations weren't combat. January 3rd arrived cold and overcast. The testing facility was crowded with observers. Colonel Blake stood in the corner with 2 MPs ready to arrest Eddie if the demonstration failed. General Bradley's intelligence chief sat in the front row expressionless. Major Sterling paced nervously near the door. The test scenario was straightforward, but terrifying. American forces had identified a German reconnaissance unit operating 12 miles east. The unit was probing for weaknesses in American lines, reporting positions back to their command. Eddie's team would intercept their communications and attempt to redirect them away from a vulnerable sector. If they succeeded, the German unit would move to coordinates where American forces were waiting. If they failed, the Germans would detect the deception and potentially identify the American position. Real consequences. Real danger. Real stakes. Eddie sat at the captured German radio headphones pressed against his ears listening. His team surrounded him, ready to support with intelligence and voice backup. The German reconnaissance unit came on frequency at 1423 hours. Eddie recognized the operator immediately. Young voice. Nervous. Probably his first combat assignment. The operator was reporting positions to his command, describing American defenses he'd observed. Eddie waited. He needed the right moment. The command response came through. New orders for the reconnaissance unit. Continue east. Report on road conditions for potential armor advance. Eddie's hand moved to the transmitter. He'd studied the command frequency for 3 days. He knew the officer who usually transmitted. Middle-aged. Prussian accent. Tired, but professional. This is forward command. Eddie spoke in flawless German, overriding the original transmission with a stronger signal. New priority orders. American forces detected moving north. Reconnaissance unit will redirect immediately. Confirm. Silence. Eddie's heart hammered. The observers leaned forward. Colonel Blake's hand moved toward the MPs. Then the young German voice came back, uncertain but obedient. Forward command. This is Reconnaissance 7. Confirming redirect. Request new coordinates. Eddie rattled off coordinates that would take the German unit directly into an American ambush position. The voice on the other end paused. There was a long moment of static. Forward command, Reconnaissance 7 requests verification. Orders received do not match original mission parameters. This was the critical moment. The German operator was suspicious, not convinced he was being deceived, but uncertain enough to question. Eddie had prepared for this. He'd studied how German officers responded to questioning from subordinates, not with anger, with cold authority. Reconnaissance. 7. Your original mission parameters are obsolete. American forces have repositioned. You will execute new orders immediately, or explain to Panzer Group why their advance corridor was compromised by your delay. Confirm. Another pause. Then Reconnaissance 7 confirms. Executing new orders. Estimated arrival at coordinates 1630 hours. Eddie released the transmitter and exhaled. The room was silent. Then Major Sterling began to laugh. 3 hours later, the German reconnaissance unit drove directly into American positions. They were captured without firing a shot, confused about how American forces had known exactly where they'd be. General Bradley's intelligence chief stood up and shook Eddie's hand. Colonel Blake said nothing, but the MPs were dismissed. The program expanded faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, Eddie was training teams across the Western Front. Voice deception units were attached to major combat formations equipped with captured German radios and Eddie's methodology notebooks. The results were immediate and devastating. In the first month, voice deception operations redirected 14 German units. 3 Panzer companies drove into minefields. 2 supply convoys delivered ammunition to American positions instead of German ones. An entire infantry battalion spent 4 hours marching in circles after receiving contradictory orders from voices they couldn't distinguish from their own command. German casualty reports spiked. But more importantly, German efficiency collapsed. Commanders stopped trusting radio orders. They demanded in-person verification for routine communications. Response times that had been measured in minutes stretched to hours, as every order was questioned, double-checked, authenticated through slow and cumbersome procedures. The paranoia Eddie had created in that Belgian foxhole spread like a virus through the German military. But success brought new problems. Some American units didn't believe the methodology worked. They'd been fighting Germans for months with conventional tactics and didn't see why they needed theatrical tricks to win battles. Eddie found himself traveling to frontline positions, demonstrating his techniques to skeptical officers who thought psychological warfare was for cowards. Other problems were more serious. The Germans weren't stupid. Their intelligence services had begun analyzing the phantom transmissions, looking for patterns, trying to identify the American operators. And they'd started developing countermeasures. New authentication codes, frequency changes, voice verification procedures. Eddie's methodology worked because the Germans trusted their communication systems. Once that trust was gone, the advantage disappeared. In late January, Eddie intercepted a transmission that changed everything. German intelligence had identified 3 of his voice deception operators by their speech patterns. They'd cross-referenced recordings, analyzed accent variations, mapped the American methodology. And they'd issued orders to every unit on the Western Front. The ghost voices were no longer anonymous. The Germans knew exactly what the Americans were doing, and they were preparing a response. Eddie stared at his notes as the implications sank in. His program had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But that success had made him a target. Somewhere in German intelligence, specialists were studying his voice, his techniques, his patterns. They were building a profile of the man who'd destroyed Iron Fist 4. And they were planning countermeasures that could turn his own methodology against him. The hunters had become the hunted. In Part 3, we'll discover what happened when German intelligence launched Operation Silent Voice, their desperate attempt to identify and eliminate the American ghost voices. How Eddie found himself fighting a psychological war against an enemy who'd learned his own techniques, and why the most dangerous moment of the entire program came not from German countermeasures, but from an American traitor who threatened to expose everything. The voice in the static had become famous, and fame in warfare was often fatal, from a frozen foxhole in Belgium to the most classified program on the Western Front. In Part 1, Eddie Voss broke every rule to save 300 lives with nothing but a captured radio and perfect German. In Part 2, he transformed that desperate act into an official weapon of war training teams of voice deception operators who redirected German units into ambushes, minefields, and chaos. 14 enemy units deceived, 3 Panzer companies destroyed, an entire military communication network paralyzed by paranoia. But success had made Eddie famous, and fame in warfare was fatal. German intelligence had identified his operators. They'd analyzed speech patterns, mapped frequencies, studied the American methodology. And now they were preparing a response that would turn Eddie's own techniques against him. Operation Silent Voice. The hunters had become the hunted. This was no longer an experiment. This was war. The report arrived at German Army Group B headquarters on January 28, 1945. Colonel Werner Stahl, Chief of Signals Intelligence, read it 3 times before summoning his staff. The Americans had developed something new, something dangerous, something that had cost the Wehrmacht over 400 casualties in 6 weeks without a single shot being fired. Stahl had spent 15 years building German radio security protocols. He'd designed authentication systems, trained operators, created the communication infrastructure that allowed panzer divisions to coordinate across hundreds of miles. And now some American was using that infrastructure against them. The evidence was undeniable. 14 separate incidents of phantom orders. German units redirected into ambushes. Supply convoys delivering ammunition to enemy positions. An entire reconnaissance battalion captured because they trusted a voice that didn't exist. Stahl's analysis was precise and terrifying. The Americans weren't just intercepting German communications. They were participating in them. They had operators who could speak German so perfectly, with such accurate military terminology and emotional authenticity, that experienced commanders couldn't distinguish them from legitimate officers. This is psychological warfare at a level we've never encountered, Stahl told his staff. They're not just deceiving our units. They're destroying our trust in our own command structure. The implications were staggering. Every order transmitted by radio was now suspect. Every voice could be an enemy. The efficiency that had made German military communication legendary was becoming a liability. Stahl's countermeasures were immediate and comprehensive. New authentication codes were distributed to every unit. Voice verification procedures were implemented, requiring personal information only legitimate officers would know. Frequency rotation schedules were accelerated. And most importantly, Stahl assigned a team of specialists to analyze every phantom transmission, looking for patterns that would identify the American operators. Within 2 weeks, they had results. 3 distinct voice profiles had been isolated. American operators with specific accent variations, speech patterns, verbal habits that appeared consistently across multiple deceptions. The Germans couldn't identify names yet, but they were building profiles, and they were developing something far more dangerous: counter-deception. If the Americans could impersonate German officers, German intelligence could impersonate Americans, impersonating Germans. They could feed false information through the phantom voices. They could lead American units into traps. They could turn Eddie's own methodology into a weapon against him. The war of voices had begun, but this wasn't the only threat Eddie faced. The crisis hit on February 3, 1945. Private First Class Raymond Koch, one of Eddie's trained operators, disappeared from his post near Aachen. He took his equipment, his notebooks, and 3 months of operational intelligence about voice deception protocols. Koch was captured by German forces 2 days later, or perhaps he surrendered voluntarily. The circumstances were never fully clarified. What was clear was that German intelligence now had everything: training methodologies, frequency lists, voice profiles of American operators. The authentication techniques Eddie had developed to make phantom transmissions undetectable. Major Sterling delivered the news to Eddie personally. His face was gray. "We have to assume the entire program is compromised. Everything you've built, every technique, every operator. The Germans know it all now." Eddie sat in silence, processing the implications. Koch had been one of his best students, a German-American from Cincinnati whose accent was flawless. Eddie had trusted him with sensitive operations, and now that trust had destroyed everything. The accusations came quickly. Colonel Blake, who had opposed the program from the beginning, demanded immediate termination. He argued that voice deception had always been reckless, that Eddie's cowboy methodology had created a vulnerability that conventional psychological operations would never have allowed. Others blamed Eddie directly. He'd selected Koch. He'd trained him. He'd given him access to operational intelligence without proper security vetting. The program's success had made Eddie careless, and now American soldiers would pay the price. For 3 days, Eddie's voice deception units were ordered to cease all operations. Teams that had been redirecting German units, saving lives, changing the course of battles, sat idle, while bureaucrats debated whether the program should continue. Eddie spent those 3 days analyzing German communications. He monitored their frequencies constantly, listening for signs of how they would exploit Koch's intelligence. And on the 3rd night, he heard something that changed everything. The Germans were planning to use Koch's information for a massive counter-deception operation. They would broadcast phantom American voices drawing U.S. units into prepared kill zones. They would turn Eddie's methodology into a weapon of mass destruction. But they'd made one mistake. They didn't know Eddie was still listening. February 7, 1945. The Roer River, Germany. American forces were preparing for Operation Grenade, a massive crossing that would breach the last major water barrier before the Rhine. Intelligence estimated 30,000 German troops defending the opposite bank. Artillery positions, machine gun nests, panzer reserves waiting to counterattack. The crossing would be costly. Commanders expected casualties in the thousands. But Eddie had heard something in the German communications that changed the calculation entirely. The Germans were planning their counter-deception for February 8th. They would broadcast phantom orders to American units, redirecting assault forces into concentrated killing zones. Koch had given them the frequencies, the protocols, the voice patterns. They believed they could turn Eddie's weapon against its creators. Eddie requested an emergency meeting with General Simpson's staff. He brought transcripts. He brought frequency logs. He brought evidence of the German counter-deception plan. And he proposed something insane. Let me broadcast during the crossing. Not deception. Counter-deception. If the Germans are going to impersonate Americans impersonating Germans, I'll impersonate Germans responding to Americans who are actually Germans pretending to be us. The room went silent. Eddie continued. They think they know our methodology. They think Koch gave them everything. But Koch never understood the psychology. He could mimic voices, but he never learned to hear patterns. I can identify they're fake Americans within seconds. And once I identify them, I can feed them false confirmations that lead their own units into our kill zones. General Simpson's intelligence chief stared at Eddie for a long moment. You want to out-deceive the deceivers? Yes, sir, while simultaneously running legitimate deception operations against their actual commanders. Yes, sir, using the same frequencies. Yes, sir. The chief shook his head slowly. That's the most complicated psychological operation I've ever heard proposed. Eddie nodded. That's why it will work, sir. They won't expect it. The operation was approved at 2300 hours on February 6th. Eddie had less than 12 hours to prepare. Dawn. February 7th. The Roer River Valley filled with fog. American artillery began its bombardment at 02:45. The sound was apocalyptic. Thousands of shells screaming across the water. German positions exploding in cascades of fire and earth. Eddie sat in a communications vehicle 400 meters from the riverbank, surrounded by 3 radio sets each tuned to different frequencies. His team of 4 operators flanked him, headphones pressed tight, pencils ready. The German counter-deception began at 0312. Eddie heard it immediately. A voice claiming to be American command broadcasting orders in English. All units. Redirect to crossing point Delta. German defenses weakened. Concentrate forces. The accent was perfect. The terminology was accurate. But the rhythm was wrong. Too precise. Too formal. Germans speaking English they'd learned from textbooks, not from Milwaukee street corners. Eddie keyed his transmitter on the German command frequency. Achtung! American deception detected on frequency 7. All units disregard English transmissions. Maintain original positions. His German was flawless, authoritative, the voice of a Wehrmacht signals officer protecting his communication network. Confusion rippled through the German lines. Their counter-deception operators hesitated. Was this a real German officer or another American phantom? In that moment of hesitation, Eddie struck again. German artillery battery Foxtrot. American forces approaching your position from the north. Redirect fire immediately. Coordinates follow. The coordinates Eddie gave were empty. A marsh 800 meters from any American unit. But the German battery commander, confused by the chaos of voices, paranoid about phantom transmissions, made a decision. He redirected his guns. 16 artillery pieces that should have been slaughtering American soldiers crossing the Roer Instead, pounded empty swampland for 11 minutes. 11 minutes that saved over 200 lives. Eddie didn't stop. For the next 4 hours, he conducted the most complex psychological operation of the entire war. He identified German counter-deception transmissions and neutralized them with false confirmations. He broadcast phantom orders to actual German units, redirecting reinforcements away from the crossing points. He impersonated 3 different German officers, simultaneously maintaining separate voices, separate personalities, separate command relationships. His operators supported him with intelligence monitoring frequencies, flagging suspicious transmissions, feeding him information in real time. It was chaos orchestrated into weapon. By noon, American forces had established 3 bridgeheads across the Ruhr. German counterattacks that should have pushed them back into the river never materialized. Panzer reserves received conflicting orders and arrived hours late. Artillery batteries targeted phantom positions, while real American soldiers advanced unopposed. The crossing succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Casualties were 60% lower than projected. Over 100 American soldiers, who should have died that morning, walked across the Ruhr instead because German commanders couldn't trust their own radios. General Simpson's after-action report was unprecedented. Voice deception operations contributed decisively to Operation Grenade success. Recommend immediate expansion of program. Corporal Voss demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally alter the nature of military communication warfare. Eddie was promoted to sergeant that afternoon, but he barely noticed. He was already analyzing German communications for the next operation. The Rhine crossing was coming, and he intended to be ready. The impact of the Ruhr River operation spread through the American military like wildfire. Within days, every major command wanted voice deception units. Training programs that had been struggling for resources suddenly received unlimited funding. Eddie's methodology notebooks were classified top secret and distributed to intelligence schools across Europe. The statistics were undeniable. In February 1945 alone, voice deception operations were credited with redirecting 23 German units. Artillery batteries were turned against empty positions. Reinforcement columns arrived at wrong locations. Supply convoys delivered fuel to American tank formations instead of German ones. Conservative estimates suggested over 2,000 American lives saved in a single month. German military efficiency collapsed. Communication that had once been instantaneous now required multiple verification steps. Orders that should have been executed in minutes took hours as commanders demanded in-person confirmation. The paranoia Eddie had created in that Belgian foxhole had spread to every level of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers began calling it Geisterstimmen, ghost voices. They told stories of phantom commanders who appeared on frequencies and vanished. Of orders that came from nowhere and led to death. Of an American who spoke German so perfectly that even native speakers couldn't identify him. Morale plummeted. Units that had fought with discipline for years began questioning every command. The German military machine, famous for its efficiency and coordination, was grinding to a halt because soldiers couldn't trust their own officers' voices. Eddie received commendations from 3 different generals. His name appeared in classified intelligence briefings read by Eisenhower himself. The telephone company Troubleshooter from Milwaukee had become one of the most valuable assets in the European theater. But Eddie didn't care about recognition. Every night, he still thought about Klaus, about the German commander he'd sent to death with a voice that sounded like home, about the weight of deception that had saved thousands but cost him something he couldn't name. The ghost voices had won the war of frequencies, but the ghost who created them was haunted by what he'd become. March 1945. Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine, the last barrier before the German heartland. Eddie's voice deception units were positioned along the entire front ready for the largest coordinated psychological operation of the war. But questions remained. What would happen when the war ended? What would happen to the men who'd learned to become enemies? What would happen to Eddie Voss, the man who'd broken every rule and changed military communication forever? The Army had already begun classifying everything related to voice deception. Documents were disappearing. Official histories were being written without any mention of phantom transmissions. The most successful psychological operation of World War II was being erased from the record, and Eddie was beginning to understand why. In Part 4, we'll discover what happened when the war ended and the Army decided what to do with its ghost voices. How Eddie Voss returned to civilian life, carrying secrets he could never share. Why the voice deception program was buried so deeply that historians wouldn't discover it for decades. And the final haunting truth about the man who saved thousands of lives by becoming someone else. The war was almost over. But Eddie's story had one more chapter. A chapter that would remain classified for 50 years. A chapter that revealed the true cost of becoming a ghost. From a frozen foxhole in Belgium to the most classified psychological operation of World War II. Eddie Voss started as a telephone company troubleshooter from Milwaukee who spoke German because his grandmother taught him. He ended as the most dangerous voice on the Western Front, a man who saved over 3,000 American lives by becoming the enemy. He broke every rule in the military handbook. He was threatened with court-martial. He was nearly destroyed by a traitor who sold his secrets. And yet, he persevered, turning paranoia into a weapon, transforming German communication networks into instruments of their own destruction. The Battle of the Bulge, the Roer River crossing, the March to the Rhine. Eddie's ghost voices haunted every German frequency, redirecting units, misdirecting artillery, sowing chaos that shortened the war by weeks. But what happened to the man behind the voice? What became of Eddie Voss when the guns fell silent and the radios went dark? This story has one final chapter. A chapter that reveals the true cost of becoming someone else. Because success, as Eddie would discover, sometimes came with a price no metal could pay. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Eddie Voss was in a communications center near Reims when the surrender was announced, still monitoring German frequencies out of habit, still listening for patterns in voices that had finally gone silent. He was 22 years old. He'd spent 18 months in combat zones. He'd personally directed operations that saved thousands of American lives and killed hundreds of German soldiers. And he felt nothing. The celebration around him seemed distant, muffled, like hearing a party through thick walls. Other soldiers were laughing, crying, firing weapons into the air. Eddie sat at his radio station and stared at the silent frequencies where Klaus had once spoken. Where phantom voices had sent men to their deaths. Where he'd become someone else so completely that he sometimes forgot who he'd been before. The Army processed Eddie's discharge with remarkable efficiency. His service record was exemplary, but strangely incomplete. Large sections had been classified or simply removed. The voice deception program was being erased from official history, and Eddie was being erased along with it. He received the Bronze Star for meritorious service in a small ceremony attended by Major Sterling and 3 officers whose names he didn't recognize. The citation mentioned exceptional communication support during critical operations. It said nothing about German impersonation, phantom transmissions, or the hundreds of enemy soldiers who died believing they were following legitimate orders. Colonel Blake, who had threatened Eddie with court-martial in that Luxembourg office, was not present. Eddie later learned Blake had received a commendation for overseeing innovative psychological operations in the European theater. The irony was not lost on him. Eddie returned to Milwaukee in July 1945. His parents met him at the train station, older than he remembered, worn down by years of being German Americans during a war against Germany. His mother cried. His father shook his hand with a grip that said everything words couldn't express. "Welcome home, son," his father said in English. They didn't speak German anymore. Neither did Eddie. He got his old job back at the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1947. They had 3 children. He worked as a troubleshooter for 32 years, listening to the hum of transformers, the rhythm of circuit breakers, the patterns in electrical systems that most people never noticed. His coworkers thought he was quiet, competent, unremarkable. None of them knew that the unassuming man fixing their power lines had once commanded the most sophisticated psychological operation of World War II. Eddie never talked about the war. When his children asked, he said he'd been a radio operator. When they pressed for stories, he told them about the cold, the food, the boredom. He never mentioned Klaus. He never mentioned the voice he'd used to send men to their deaths. He never mentioned the weight he carried every day, the knowledge that somewhere in Germany there were widows and orphans created by words he'd spoken into a microphone. Dorothy knew something had happened. She could see it in the way Eddie sometimes stared at nothing in the nightmares that woke him speaking German, in the way he flinched when radios crackled with static. But she never asked, and Eddie never told. The army had made him sign documents promising never to discuss classified operations. But it wasn't security clearance that kept Eddie silent. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain even to himself. He'd saved lives by taking them. He'd been a hero by becoming a ghost. And ghosts, Eddie had learned, didn't get to go home. They just learned to pretend they had. But the legacy Eddie created didn't stay buried forever. The voice deception techniques Eddie pioneered in 1944 didn't disappear when the war ended. They evolved. They spread. They became the foundation for an entirely new form of military psychological operations that would shape conflicts for the next 80 years. In 1950, during the Korean War, American forces deployed voice deception units trained using methodologies directly descended from Eddie's original notebooks. These units broadcast phantom orders to Chinese and North Korean forces, redirecting units, creating confusion, exploiting the same psychological vulnerabilities Eddie had identified in German communications. The results were similar. Entire battalions received contradictory orders. Artillery batteries targeted empty positions. Supply convoys drove in circles, while American forces advanced unopposed. Conservative estimates suggest voice deception operations in Korea saved over 200 American lives. Vietnam saw even more sophisticated applications. By the 1960s, Eddie's basic methodology had been combined with electronic warfare signal jamming and computer analysis to create comprehensive communication disruption systems. American forces could now not only impersonate enemy commanders, but simultaneously jam legitimate transmissions, creating chaos that made phantom voices the only voices enemy units could hear. The statistics from Vietnam were classified for decades, but documents released in 2003 revealed that psychological operations derived from World War II voice deception techniques were credited with disrupting over 400 enemy operations between 1965 and 1972. The methodology Eddie developed in a frozen Belgian foxhole had become a permanent feature of American military doctrine. Modern warfare has taken Eddie's principles even further. Today's psychological operations use artificial intelligence to analyze enemy communication patterns, synthetic voice technology to create perfect impersonations, and cyber warfare capabilities to inject phantom transmissions directly into enemy networks. The ghost voices of 1944 have become digital specters, invisible and omnipresent. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, coalition forces used communication deception techniques to convince Iraqi commanders that attacks were coming from directions opposite to actual assault vectors. During operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, psychological warfare units employed Eddie's core insight that people trust patterns more than they verify authenticity to disrupt insurgent communication networks and redirect enemy forces into prepared positions. The numbers tell the story. Since World War II, voice deception and its descendant technologies have been deployed in over 40 military conflicts across 6 continents. Military analysts estimate these techniques have saved between 15,000 and 25,000 American and Allied lives since 1944. Eddie Voss, the telephone troubleshooter who listened to transformers hum, created a methodology that has protected soldiers for 8 decades. But Eddie never knew any of this. The classification of his work meant he died in 1987 without ever learning the full impact of what he'd created. He never knew that his notebooks were studied at military academies. He never knew that officers wrote dissertations analyzing his techniques. He never knew that the desperate improvisation of one frozen December night had become the foundation for an entire branch of military science. The ghost who went home never learned he'd become a legend. But the legacy Eddie left behind wasn't just technical. The story of Eddie Voss teaches us something profound about innovation, about courage, and about the nature of change itself. Great ideas don't always come from generals in war rooms or scientists in laboratories. Sometimes they come from telephone troubleshooters in foxholes. Sometimes the person who sees the solution is someone the system never thought to ask. Eddie wasn't trained in psychological warfare. He wasn't authorized to monitor enemy frequencies. He wasn't supposed to be anything more than a radio operator who fixed equipment and relayed messages. But he saw something that trained intelligence officers missed. He heard patterns that sophisticated analysis overlooked. And when the moment came, he had the courage to act on what he knew, even though acting meant breaking every rule that defined his role. This is the deeper lesson of Eddie's story. Institutions resist change. Systems protect themselves. The same protocols designed to prevent mistakes also prevent innovation. Colonel Blake wasn't wrong to be cautious. His concerns about operational security, about untrained personnel making dangerous decisions, about the risks of unauthorized action, these were legitimate concerns. But they were also the concerns that would have let 300 American soldiers die in their sleep. History is filled with similar stories. The British officer who invented the tank was told armored vehicles were impractical. The American general who proposed strategic bombing was court-martialed for his views. The engineer who designed radar was ignored for years because his superiors couldn't imagine invisible waves detecting aircraft. Innovation in warfare, and perhaps in all human endeavors, requires someone willing to be called crazy. Someone willing to risk their career, their reputation, their freedom for an idea that everyone else has rejected. Eddie Voss was that someone. He didn't set out to revolutionize psychological warfare. He set out to save 300 men he'd never met from tanks he'd only heard through static. The revolution came later, almost by accident, because one person refused to accept that the rules were more important than the lives those rules were supposed to protect. Today, in boardrooms and laboratories and military planning centers around the world, there are Eddie Vosses waiting to be heard. People with ideas that seem crazy. People whose innovations are being rejected by systems designed to maintain the status quo. The question isn't whether these people exist. The question is whether we'll listen to them before it's too late. And there's one final detail of Eddie's story that almost no one knows. In 2019, a researcher at the National Archives discovered a document that had been misfiled for 74 years. It was a German intelligence report from February 1945, recovered from Wehrmacht headquarters after the war, and translated by American intelligence officers. The report was titled, Analysis of American Phantom Voice Operations, and it contained something remarkable. German intelligence had eventually identified Eddie Voss, not by name, but by voice. Their analysts had isolated his speech patterns across dozens of phantom transmissions, creating a profile of the American operator they called Der Geisterführer, the Ghost Commander. The report described him with something approaching respect. Subject demonstrates exceptional understanding of Wehrmacht communication protocols and psychological vulnerabilities. Accent analysis suggests German heritage, possibly second-generation immigrant from northern Germany region. Subject appears to have studied individual German operators extensively, demonstrating ability to exploit personal characteristics, including trauma responses and command relationships. Assessment. Subject represents most significant threat to Wehrmacht communication integrity currently operating in European theater. But the truly remarkable passage came at the end. Recommendation: do not attempt to neutralize subject through conventional means. Subject's value as intelligence asset exceeds value as elimination target. If subject can be identified and captured, potential for counter-recruitment should be explored. Note: voice analysis suggests subject experiences significant emotional conflict regarding operations. Pattern variations detected in transmissions involving direct casualties indicate possible psychological vulnerability. Subject may be more receptive to alternative engagement than typical enemy operator. The Germans had heard something in Eddie's voice that even Eddie didn't fully recognize. They'd heard his guilt. They'd heard his humanity. They'd heard the weight of sending men to their deaths, even enemy men, even men who would have killed his friends without hesitation. The Ghost Commander wasn't just a weapon, he was a person. And somehow, across the static and the frequencies and the chaos of war, German intelligence had recognized that. Eddie Voss died in 1987 without ever seeing this document. He never knew that even his enemies had understood what his deceptions cost him. He never knew that somewhere in a German archive there was evidence that he'd remained human even while becoming a ghost. Perhaps that's the most important thing about Eddie's story. He did terrible things for good reasons. He saved thousands of lives by taking hundreds. He became someone else so completely that he sometimes forgot himself. But he never stopped feeling the weight of it. He never became the cold, calculating weapon that circumstances demanded. He remained Eddie Voss, the troubleshooter from Milwaukee, who listened to patterns and heard people. And that's why his story matters. From a telephone company troubleshooter with a forbidden skill to the architect of modern psychological warfare, Eddie Voss proved that innovation doesn't require permission, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words. He saved over 3,000 American lives directly. His techniques have protected perhaps 20,000 more in the 8 decades since. He never received proper recognition. He never told his story. He carried the weight of his ghost voices alone until the day he died. But now you know. You know about the frozen foxhole and the captured radio. You know about Klaus and the voice that sent 40 tanks to their destruction. You know about the court-martial threats and the stolen equipment and the moment one man decided that rules mattered less than lives. If this story moved you, there are hundreds more like it. Hidden histories of World War II. Forgotten heroes who changed everything. Ideas that seemed impossible until someone proved they weren't. Subscribe to discover more stories that history tried to bury. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their crazy idea might just save the world. And remember Eddie Voss. Remember that he never fired a shot in combat. Remember that his greatest weapon was understanding. Remember that he became a ghost so others could remain alive. In the end, war isn't always won by those who follow orders. Sometimes it's won by those who understand when orders would cost more than breaking them. Eddie Voss understood. And 3,000 families never had to bury their sons because a telephone troubleshooter from Milwaukee spoke perfect German into the void.